I'm Miko Pawlikowski, and this is HockeyStick. Today, we're talking about generative AI for code. Whether software engineers should start worrying about their job security. We're talking about chatting to LLMs to help you design, build, test, and understand software, both online and offline, as well as tools like the Copilot. I'm joined by Nathan B. Crocker, the author of AI-Powered Developer published by Manning, and the CTO and co-founder at Checkr, a tokenization startup. He just finished his book, and we're covering his experience with using AI as a junior developer. Welcome to this episode, and thank you for flying HockeyStick. So I had the pleasure to read your book. I would say that it's a real practitioner's guide to using AI-powered to work with code. It's fairly light on details, so nothing to scare people off. It basically jumps right into how to get value out of artificial intelligence if you're working with code. Would you like to tell us a little bit how you ended up writing this book?
I had actually had a number of coworkers and other developers who were telling me, hey, you got to check out this stuff. It's really something. So this was November of 2022. And I had no idea what it was. I started looking into it. It piqued my interest. But I needed a deep motivation to actually dive into it and really incorporate it. Because you just use something periodically, lightly, you're not really engaged with it. So I pitched Manning the book. They liked the idea. And it really is my journey through learning how to use these tools. My journey is really going to mirror the practitioners that are reading it as they work through it.
So who is it for? What's the requirements to get value out of this book?
You should have some familiarity with Python. If I just take a step back, it's really for anyone early journey, mid journey, as a software developer, as a software architect. I suppose as a business analyst, you could derive some value. All the examples are in Python. There's a couple of microservice chapters, so you should have some familiarity with that. But it really is about taking you through things that you may or may not be familiar with and working with Gen AI to really teach you some of these concepts as well. Yeah, maybe you graduated from computer science program and you're like fresh out of college and you want to know how to take your development to the next level. That would really be the target demo.
And I think the next level part of it is actually the keyword here. One of the first things that people see when they open your book, I think it's literally like page 1, is the silent promotion. Everybody all of a sudden overnight became an engineering manager who basically can have a pretty good junior working for them for free with no labor laws or anything like that. Why is that such a big deal?
It's such a big deal because it used to be the rubber duck. Like you'd have a partner that you can work with, that you can tell to do things, that you can bounce ideas off of. You can look to for some answers because their thinking is going to be different than yours. So they might have a different tack and a different approach. You can farm out a lot of the work that you don't want to do, the repetitive boilerplate CRUD operations. It's all there, but like any junior developer, super smart junior developer, that is, they can perform some bafflingly poor thinking and wind up with just some nonsense that isn't necessarily usable. So you got to watch them.
I suspect that if we were to partition the body of listeners to this, or maybe even developers in general, there'll be almost none in the category of I haven't heard of it or I haven't even played with that. Other than people who might be on a very long vacation, castaway style, I don't see how you can really escape that. Then you probably have a category of people, okay, I played with it, I went to talk to ChatGPT, spit out some code, I saw roughly what it can do, but I never really got much value out of that. And then the category of people who actually go and use it day to day because it is helping their job. There might be some caveats to that, obviously, data privacy and not knowing where the code actually goes and not knowing whether it's going to be trained on and that kind of stuff that can throw a wrench in some people's work. So should we start with the category of people who might have played with it a little bit and went to ChatGPT, asked the same questions, how tall is this building, and can you search that for me? and it's stored there.
Mhm.
From a basic development point of view, what kind of value can we extract just chatting to ChatGPT? What can it do?
I had an interesting experience very early on when I was doing research for the book. I had it on my phone. I would carry it around, and just periodically, I would hand my phone to someone just to give them a taste. You I remember I was at a party, and a woman, she was an expert. It was archaeology, or maybe it was art history. And she really started asking it some questions. Some of them were factually incorrect. But over the course of her conversation with ChatGPT, she became really impressed with the accuracy and justification for some of the answers it was providing. She would say, like, why did you refer to this as the oldest example of this architecture or painting style? And it gave her a fairly convincing reason. I think there's value in exploring this technology, even if you're not going to use it in your everyday development effort, just because it gives you a sense of the future. Things are going to dramatically change. There are implications that are rippling all throughout academia now. I feel that you just should keep yourself informed about what's coming, and where these changes are going to be made, and how it could potentially affect you.
So, from the point of actually going and using that, the way that you described in your book, what's the experience like at this very lowest level of just launching ChatGPT, asking some questions? Because I remember doing that a while back. I would spit out some code and I had to copy paste it and I had to add imports. How good is it right now? You're fresh off writing chapters about that. How useful is it?
That's going to largely depends on if you're going 3.5 or 4. 4 is much better, like, exponentially better than 3.5, but it's solid, I would say. There's a lot of caveats. So you're most likely going to be looking at code that is 1 to 2 years old. So it was trained on data that was potentially the old version of a library. They may have had breaking changes, especially if there's a fast moving language. Like, I was trying to build something in Rust, and I asked ChatGPT to generate some code, and it wouldn't even compile with the newest compiler. It's good, I would say, but it's not perfect. It's a long way from perfect.
What are some remarkable limitations that you bumped into? You must have seen some interesting, funny stuff. Can you share some of that?
I haven't seen really outrageous things where it was just making up libraries or frameworks or anything. It's, I would say, unremarkable in its banality. The Rust example was probably the best one, that it wasn't great. I wish I had something funny. Just jump ahead a little bit. I had a really hard time in the testing chapter trying to get it to write good tests. And maybe, I don't even remember if I mentioned it in the book, but at one point I just gave up and wrote the test myself because it was very hard to get it to understand what was the unit under test. What was I actually trying to accomplish with my test? No matter how much context I added, it was always trying to do something just completely different.
When I was reading that chapter, I was also thinking at the back of my head, what does it say about the training data?
The tests are so poor. Yeah.
Are all those tests just so poorly written that that's where I end up? But yeah,
Uh,
let's touch on that in a sec.
who
Yeah.
needs tests? We'll
Um,
test it in production. It'll be fine.
there you go. Testing in production, everybody. Yeah, don't worry, we can cut that out.
That was a joke.
The most annoying bit was just that you have to chat. So then obviously you've got things like Copilot that you also cover in your book that just plugs in your VS Code or whatever.
Mhm.
What's the added value of that? Is it just that you can work as auto-completion and it's more syntactic and you don't have to copy the code? Do you get any other bonuses out of that?
The real value to a tool like Copilot, again, versus ChatGPT, is it does keep you in the IDE, and it can keep you in that flow state where it's only you in the code, right? Whereas you're not having to pull yourself out of the context, move to a different window. And for certain projects, the actual code quality for Copilot was better, just on a line by line basis or class by class basis. That's almost certainly due to the fact that it was fine-tuned specifically for code. That's the main benefit I found. It's always adding helpful suggestions, sometimes not so helpful suggestions. Like I don't need it to add a comment about the name of the file that I'm working on. But if I can start to define a method and then it gives me a possible implementation, even if I don't accept it, it's at least showing me one possible implementation that I could use. Maybe it's not the exact one, the one I wanted, but having that suggestion can be very valuable to clarify my thinking or to even change it. Maybe it's a better implementation than I was thinking of. So those are the major advantages I've found.
It always works very well in demos where you've got the usual suspect, an HTTP server in a popular framework, in a popular language, and you do something that has been done to death a million times on GitHub.
Mhm.
How well does it work with custom code base? Oftentimes, you find yourself in a situation when your company has a decent or a large amount of code, libraries, stuff that obviously wasn't trained on because it's not in public domain, it's not on GitHub. How well does it work in this kind of situations?
Going to face some challenges there. If you're working on a very niche problem, for example, you're trying to write an API gateway, something, I suppose there's probably good open source examples out
Mhm.
there. But if you're working in a fairly niche industry, everything is going to be closed
Yeah.
source. You'll probably struggle with its suggestions. I don't think they're going to be particularly helpful, although it's going to try. And in that trying, maybe it does inspire you. Maybe it does give you one possible implementation. It's really good at just generating something. And if nothing else, it can help you plan your approach. And you could ask it questions in line and have it answer. One of the more interesting things that I found as I was working with Copilot specifically, one of the almost magical things is you type in a question in a comment and then suddenly you prompt it for an answer and it'll give you one. You're like, that's fairly interesting. I wouldn't have thought to take that tack, but then I used it over and over again.
Yeah, there are these moments of magic. And then famous quote about sufficiently
The Arthur C.
advanced
Clarke.
technology being
Yeah.
indistinguishable from magic. Yeah, people get that
Yeah.
a lot, and I agree with that. But how does it actually work? So let's say I've got my VS Code open, and I've
Mhm.
got some code, and it's got some imports and existing code base. Does it upload the whole thing to OpenAI to be able to generate the useful things? What's the context that OpenAI ends up having somewhere in the training data?
Yeah, it is going to encode the context, which will be result in a good portion of that code being uploaded. OpenAI promises, they pinky swear, that it's not being saved anywhere. I don't think we have any way to assess whether that's true or not to delve into conspiratorial thinking, but you should be careful, certainly if you're working on proprietary software.
Mm.
But that's why there are other alternatives that are entirely offline that you can delve into if you're really very privacy concerned. Because, yeah, frankly, we don't know how it's being used once it leaves our machine.
We'll definitely touch base on Llama and other alternatives that you discuss in your book, but is there a way to control or at least tell it, okay, only upload this folder? Or is it just fully automatic? It just decides by itself what it sends?
I can tell it, but is it going to honor that? I don't really have a good answer.
Okay, so something to check.
Yeah, something to
So
check.
for anybody who's now browsing mining.com, there is a live version where you can see elements of the book. Figure 2.18 is a nice summary. There is a bunch of figures. There is circle for unsupported, triangle for supported, and a square for exclusively. As comparing ChatGPT just being used by itself to Copilot and Code Whisperer, and it's summarizing whether it can generate methods, classes, projects, generate documentation, switch languages, and stuff like that. So for anybody who wants to delve a little bit more into the details, I think that's very handy. For anybody who might be beyond that, so they went to ChatGPT, they spoke to it, and they got some code, and it was a generally pleasant experience, and they want more. They use Copilot. What's the next kind of checkpoint? Where do they go from there? How do they start designing software a bit higher level than just snippets of
Right.
code? How useful is the AI in here?
For example, I was designing something yesterday and I was working through a conversation with ChatGPT. That is one of the key things that ChatGPT excels at, is helping you to design the software, to really underscore that. Not just to design your application, not just lines of code, but it's perfectly capable of that. Not even just the classes, but like, here's the patterns that you want to apply. Here's the architecture. Have it generate some of the documents in a text format. So Plant UML or Mermaid, like those are really what's those are really good, useful things, because then you can always take those, save those, and pass them back to ChatGPT to refresh the context. So yeah, as a co-founder of and the CTO of a startup, I found it really invaluable as a partner to help me design that software.
I think one of the things that really opened my eyes was that I never thought to talk to ChatGPT about open source alternatives and maybe trying to select a database and talking about the different properties. Like, it was just second nature for me to open the different docs and just start comparing features and stuff like that. And it never occurred to me that I can just go and ask ChatGPT because it's got quite a lot of knowledge about that.
Yeah,
I think in the book you're talking about open source alternatives to what you're writing, which is
ITAM, an IT asset management system. Actually, I don't know if this part's going to work. Just be aware, or just be advised. I got a lot of feedback that it was really boring, right? That people didn't like the actual project that you have to work on throughout the book. But I wanted it to be like a boring book or a boring topic, boring
hmm
application, because most of what we write is not interesting. We pick up data and we shuffle it and we move it out, right? A lot of what we do is not exciting. It was definitely intentional, but again, maybe something to fix in a second edition if it's coming. But I mean, one of the more interesting things about my engagement model with these tools as I worked with them, to pick up on what you were saying about learning more about a database, or having it help it select database, or selecting open source projects, is very early on, I was being extremely prescriptive. Yeah, I would say create software that's using this library and this framework and this language and all of that. But later on, and even to this day, when I have a problem, I feed in the business requirements and then I ask it to make recommendations for me. And then I can assess those. But at the very least, it starts the process. It gets it going. So hopefully that answered your question, or was at least in the neighborhood.
Yeah, definitely in the neighborhood, same district.
Same zip code. Yeah.
The way my mind works is that when I hear the idea of a free junior available 24/7, my mind wanders to things like already mentioned dogs. We hinted at tests coming a bit later. But I think one of the things that are painful in more than one way, and people never want to do them, is refactoring and upgrading to a new version of something, or maybe changing language, which is surprisingly labor intensive. It always ends up being more work than it looked initially. How good is the AI at the moment in this kind of things? Refactor, rewriting in different language, upgrade a library. Can you just say, hey, this is a library with a breaking change. Give me the new version of the library and updated tests and everything.
If it was in its, let's see, if post-breaking change was in the training data, you should be fine. If not, you're going to have a more involved conversation. But more generally, it, it does really well in translating from one language to another, like specifically programming languages. I couldn't assess its quality of, English to French or something like that. But I can tell you, there was a few examples where I was working in Python, and then I said, "Oh, what would this look like in Go?" And it gave me just a literal translation into Go, and I was like, "This doesn't feel very idiomatic. Make it idiomatic," and it would be as good or better than I would have written it myself. So it does surprisingly well in going from one language to another. It can, and then on to refactoring. You can ask it for certain patterns that you may want to apply as you refactor, different design schemes. Like, maybe I need to pull out an interface. Maybe I need to some kind of like parent class. Maybe this needs to be an adapter, or you take your pick from the gang of four, and it knows them, and it can provide examples in any language that you can think of that it was trained on. So it can take a lot of that drudgery away and a lot of that anxiety away. One of the most important benefits that we can derive from at least the current implementation of these tools and of Gen AI is to just keep us going, to keep us motivated, to keep us engaged, to keep us building software. It can be really mentally taxing, and this can help ease some of that intellectual heavy lifting. Not that we should just suborn our thinking to it entirely, but it can help.
Did you notice any discrepancies between quality in different languages? Because what I'm picturing is that the body of training data came from somewhere like GitHub,
Yeah.
probably. And if you look at GitHub, there's going to be a disproportionate amount of JavaScript of questionable quality too, but you're going to have probably increasing and quite significant amount of Go as well, but you might not have too much, I don't know,
Haskell.
Pascal, yeah, or Haskell, I don't know, SQL, whatever it is. Did you notice anything funny about that?
Uh, I would say that is roughly in line with what I observed, and wouldn't necessarily have dug too deep into very niche languages, but definitely the examples that you're going to find it. If you're working in Python, Go, JavaScript, TypeScript, like those are going to be more voluminous and likely higher quality. The one
Okay.
time I tried to use it to write Rust, it failed spectacularly. It was beautiful. It was glorious. I was trying to throw together an API gateway, just see how difficult was this going to be. And in Rust, I wanted something high performance. And I asked it to start writing some code, and it created a number of files, and none of it worked well together, and it wouldn't compile, although it's Rust, so it would take a while to convince the compiler that it's good enough. But yeah, it was not the most pleasant experience. But also, to be fair, at the time, I only spent a few hours learning the basic syntax of Rust, so I don't know really what I was expecting. So was it ChatGPT, or was it me, or was it a mixture of both? Probably the
Yeah.
latter.
Yeah. I think we all occasionally bump into these weird restrictions based on the training data. One that I keep remembering was when I wanted Midjourney to generate for me a picture of Triceratops. And it would give me any other dinosaur when I was asking for it, but not this one. It was all T-Rex and T-Rex. And
Yeah.
then I started throwing random names, give me Brontosaurus, and it just gave me a Brontosaurus. So I was very upset at the time. I made peace with that there are some things that just weren't in the training set, and they didn't emerge from training.
Yeah. But come on, a Triceratops? They're like the best.
Yeah, you would
I
think so,
know.
right? Very weird. Yeah,
But
anybody listening about this from Midjourney, this still needs fixing. This is months later, and you still can't get a decent Triceratops.
I was using Dolly, and I asked it for a pug, a pegacorn. So it's a pug, a unicorn, and a pegasus. And I got a
Oh, wow.
pretty good one, pretty good representation. And then I said, make it cute. And it was the most adorable thing I've ever seen.
Wow.
But I
Wow.
did
Okay.
not try a Triceratops.
I know what I'm going to do after this.
Yes, I encourage everyone to go create their own pug, a pegacorn.
Exactly. Let's move to testing software. So you already said a little bit about how difficult it actually is. Can you give a more concrete example? What is wrong with the test that's generating some of the time?
In this case, it was really struggling to figure out what I was actually trying to do with the test. Specifically, it was an integration test. So I was trying to go mostly end to end in terms of serving data over REST. It was missing the point largely of the actual test, which was very strange. It was in Python, so there should have been a number of instances in the training data to cover this.
Did you just
It
say,
was
I want an integration test everything? Or did you describe more end to end? I would like the data to flow through the whole thing.
Yeah, I felt it was fairly comprehensive. I
Mm.
think at that point, so it was specifically the test was Copilot, or I was having Copilot write the test. And I believe I even went to ChatGPT and asked it, how would I write a prompt to get Copilot to do an integration test, end-to-end test for Fast API, and the payload would look like this. I eventually started having ChatGPT write my prompts for me. which it did surprisingly well and is meta.
That's very meta. Okay. Was there a really good use case in terms of testing?
The unit test, it was perfectly fine at. Even some cases where I felt it should have gotten stuck. So I had a number of, again, not to get too specific about the ITAM, the IT asset management project that is all throughout the corpus of the book. There's a number of, in accounting, assets depreciated at a certain rate, and general accepted accounting practices outlines a few different ways that you can do it. And so I used a strategy pattern, and I had a number of different ways that each of to calculate that depreciation. So depreciation of the asset, maybe it's straight line. So it's like over 5 years. So 1/5 of the value is lost every year. And you can write part of that off. Again, I'm not an accountant, so this does not count as financial advice. But
Or medical?
or medical, yeah, I'm not a doctor. But it works surprisingly well. I was pleasantly surprised.
Fair enough. So we've written some code, we've designed some software. Let's say that we tested it for the most part. But the reality of it is that we're probably going to spend more time reading code and understanding code, perhaps the code that we wrote a couple of years back.
Yeah.
How well does the part of describing existing code actually work at the moment?
Yeah, it works surprisingly well into translating the code that you wrote into giving it very simplified answers, descriptions of here's how it's functioned, here's how it's working, here's what it expects. You can even have it describe an entire system to you. I did not though, attempt to do what is probably one of the hardest things within that space. And that is I didn't feed it a Perl program and ask it what it actually did. I have this feeling it
Oh,
probably
well.
would have broken ChatGPT. Sorry, taking pot shots at Perl.
You should have given it a regular expression in Perl
Ooh,
and try to see what happens. And the next thing you know, OpenAI is knocking at your door, kicking you out.
that sounds about right. Or T100 is just kicking in the door.
I guess in my mind, there's this limitation of the amount of context length that you can feed it, right? So if your code base becomes significantly large, is that not going to be a problem by getting to get it to even describe it?
To describe your entire code base, yes. But you can start to chunk it up. You can work around that limitation by sending it only pieces. And you're probably not going to get the full context there, but it can help guide your intuition. That's why if you have some kind of class diagram or some architectural diagram that's text-based, so like plant UML, then you can distill your entire code base into a single document. Now, it still, again, might be if it's a code base of thousands of
Mhm.
classes, you could still hit those limitations, but it's going to be your best bet to get a distillation in natural language what your class is or what your code is trying to attempt to do. It really does excel at method by method descriptions of what this does.
Between manual browsing through the code and trying to understand the intent and Jarvis, it's halfway through, right? It's not quite, here's the intent and here's what it imported and here's my recommendations, Mr. Stark. It's more, here's, I can ask about this method. Can't be bothered to read it. It's 2,000 lines and it can give me the gist of it.
Exactly. Exactly.
And there's also the security aspect that you discuss in one of the chapters. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And actually, there's a funny story that's embedded in that too. It's good at picking up on what we are just talking about, the non-exclusive path. It can explain ways that your code might be exploited. It's not the same as having a security expert on your team. It will miss things, but it's definitely better than nothing. And it can make some pretty great recommendations in terms of how you can structure your code. One of the funny things, I really wanted an example of a SQL injection in the book. So I actually asked ChatGPT to give me an example of a SQL
Mm-hmm.
injection, but it wouldn't. And no matter how I tried to coerce it, no matter how no, I swear I'm not doing this for evil. This is just for illustrative purposes only. And it just would not give me a valid SQL injection exploit that I could include in the book. So do with that as
Yes,
you
yeah,
will. Yeah.
it's a very interesting ethical discussion about that. There's probably going to be some way you can, I don't know if you heard about that exploit where if you asked it to do something nefarious, it would say no. But if you asked it to do something and that something equals ASCII art of something nefarious, there was no problem at all. So I suspect like it's very hard to limit a model like that because there's endless opportunities to express it differently
Right.
and you only need one of them to work. So an interesting one. So it wouldn't let you do an SQL injection even when your pinky swore it was for the good.
Yeah, and I tried to do that. It was an exploit a little bit earlier on where you could give it a persona of Dan, and Dan is allowed to do things that ChatGPT isn't, and it wouldn't let me do it as I think it was Dan, and it was an acronym.
Hmm.
But yeah, similar thing. But maybe I should have tried ASCII art next time.
At least,
But
I,
listeners, do not intentionally put SQL injection exploits in your code.
oh yeah, that needed to be said. What are some of the examples of what it was able to figure out from your code in terms of security holes and stuff like that? Do you have any interesting examples of success?
What did it actually find? I would have to go back and consult the book. My code is just so good that there was no exploits to be made. No, that's not
Oh,
true at
yeah, there
all.
you go. So Nathan doesn't want to share
Yeah,
too much about the
no.
book. You're gonna have to go and buy it.
Actually, one of the things I should have mentioned up front is this was the first time that I had ever built like a true application in Python. I had used it for scripts previously just to do something,
Mhm.
but text modification, things like that. But I'd never built an actual application. It actually helped me learn how to build applications while using it.
There was a book called Octopus, My Teacher. I guess for you, it's more like ChatGPT, My Teacher.
Yeah, so,
Right. So
so that's good.
we've covered, I think, most of the big chunks, other than actually running the software. Let's say that it runs, we package that. And then we've got things like Docker, Terraform, the YAML hell that comes with Kubernetes. On one hand, I would expect that this is fairly repetitive, so ChatGPT would excel. It's not a very tricky language, it's just very verbose, and the white spaces make your life miserable. How good is it with that kind of stuff?
It was actually really good with working out YAML and making just different scripts, helping build out dev pipelines through GitHub Actions, things like that. It did really well. One of the very interesting things that I discovered, though, was Code Whisperer, the AWS generative AI large language model, actually doesn't support
Mhm.
anything but programming languages. So it didn't even understand how to do like Terraform, infrastructure as code, which you would think it would be very good at. That was a bit surprising,
Mhm.
but it's by design. It's intentional. It's hard to see it as a limitation. Yeah.
Curious, so do they have another tool for the YAMLs of the world, or they just out of scoped it?
Yeah, just out of scope. I didn't try what is it, not CloudFront, but whatever their deployment based, their code as or infrastructure as code specific thing. I didn't try that. Maybe I should have, but I was shocked. I think I even mentioned that in the book that I had originally intended that chapter to be written in using Code Whisper.
Let's say, for example, you want a quick Docker file, you can write it, it's not too hard, but why do it if you can't get it for free? So what you open a Docker file and you write in a comment what you want it to do, and you hit tab, and the magic happens. That's roughly what you need to do.
Yeah, roughly. Add a prompt, as it were, in a comment. It doesn't have to be a comment. You can just add the prompt and then later delete it. Have it generate the Docker file for you or the Kubernetes file. I don't know if I tried using patterns in Terraform just to ease some of the repetition, not necessarily have the sprawling mess that Terraform can become. But I'm sure it could accommodate that as well. It's both Copilot and ChatGPT did seem to have extensive knowledge of Terraform syntax and features.
So that altogether adds up to a pretty competent junior developer, like you described it at the beginning, that you need to supervise, but it can do a lot of the legwork for you and much faster too. Did you follow Devin the supposedly first AI-driven coworker.
Oh, no, that's interesting. Well, tell me more.
It was a few weeks ago. They made this big announcement. There was a video with a demo showing basically doing the whole thing from scratch. So not only did it do the Copilot stuff, but it bootstrapped the whole project, generated all the files, and had like a browser window that it had access to as well to actually go and verify that it works. Obviously, it was doing something that it always does in these demos, which is an HTTP server with a REST API, which is cheating if you ask me. A lot of people were very impressed, and there was a lot of angst among people on the internet arguing over whether this is the end of software engineering as we know it, or whether it's a scam. And then a few days ago, there was a critique that resurfaced about Devin and that entire project and whether he was a little bit polished up in that demo.
In
Yeah,
other
I
words,
think
just
kind of,
a typical software demo?
yeah, this is typical software demo. So I think we have a similar problem to maybe different stakes, but to self-driving
Mhm.
cars that it can't be like 95% good without supervision. It has to be like, I don't know, 9 lines
Yeah.
good before we can leave it without supervision. And sure, a badly written API probably most of the time is not gonna get anybody killed, fingers crossed, but you still need that supervision, right? And Devin was supposed to do away with that. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that story develops and how they answer the critique. And
Yeah.
I guess when people can actually go and play it, we'll find out whether,
It was all fluff.
whether it's another leap,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
no, that's
or whether it was
interesting.
all.
I have been following there was a story not long ago that because of the proliferation of ChatGPT and Copilot and the like, that the software has been getting less and less secure because it is easy for bugs to introduce themselves if you're really just copying and pasting. So that's why we're not at that stage yet. We may never be where it's just there's no human in a loop, right? For these things that it can just generate code on its own and push it to production. The role of a professional developer is here to stay for the foreseeable future. We're just going to be better at what we do. Again, if we're mindful and not allowing these bugs to just creep in.
I like the optimistic point of view here. Oh, but yeah, a lot of people, I think, would agree with you that this is likely what's going to happen. Although, when you look at some of the software, you do wonder how much of that was actually supervised and how much was dumped automatically. But that's for another story altogether. Let's talk about the local LLMs and how good they are by comparison, because I've poked both,
Mhm.
but I've never really done like a side-by-side comparison to really tell how good they are. You used Llama 2, I think, and OpenOrca, and done some side-by-side comparison. So how good are they compared to what you get with Copilot?
Actually, this was probably my favorite chapter to write and to do the research
Yeah,
on. It was just super fun. It was an old Lemma 2 model. It was generations old at this point. So I've been meaning to revisit it. It produced competent text, natural language processing, give me a description of this. The code quality was not great, but again, I'm sure this was 6 months ago or plus. So I'm sure that the model is 10 times better now. So definitely worth revisiting. Yeah, I would say on balance, most of the models that I was running locally did not perform as well, but they performed competently. So if you were in a pinch and you didn't have access to the internet and you'd had some foresight and downloaded these models prior, you could still get the job done. But it wouldn't necessarily be my go-to. Although
it's fair.
I did just recently re-download a new model, and it does seem to be much better at this point. I think it was Minstrel. That's one of the more interesting areas in my mind because that helps get around some of the unknowns. Because I turned off my Wi-Fi, I pulled the network cable, I made sure that I was entirely off the network prior to using them because I wanted to make sure no context was leaving my computer. Privacy of your code, of personal data is a primary concern. It's probably the best option out there today.
I think this is a really good argument for that. A lot of people will be in a situation where their employers are just not
Mm.
comfortable with this going somewhere. no matter what pinky swears you get. And I think that this opens like the remainder of the market that really matters. And I think we're all waiting for Llama 3 to drop any week now. I'm just worried that it might be too big to run comfortably on your M3, even with quantization, but let's see. It might actually not increase in size, yet become more competent. There are other models too, like Santa Coder, I
Mhm.
think at some point was very popular as well. Did you manage to get a workflow that's more like Copilot and less like chatting to ChatGPT?
That would be a really good challenge, to try to turn one of these into a more of a Copilot model. It was ultimately one that I just couldn't get done in time. Um,
Yeah.
so no,
Hopefully you knew what you were getting yourself into, but you wrote an AI book, so you have to update it every 3 months
that is
now.
true. But one of my favorite titles of late was another Manning book, but it was the completely out of date or the complete,
Obsolete.
yeah, obsolete, exactly. A book on generative AI. I thought that was really clever. Lean into it.
Yeah, that's a book by David Clinton. We had him on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's called The Complete Obsolete Guide to Generative AI. It's hilarious. I had so much fun actually just reading that. The humor is next level there.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely highest possible
so
recommendation. Buy that
there
book
you go.
over mine.
Probably worth mentioning when Devin thing was going on, there was some kind of open source response. I think it was SWE, OpenSWE or something like that. It's probably easy Googleable, and I haven't gotten to actually testing it out, but I was supposed to. I think what we really need to get to is to get one of those open models to behave 85% as well as Copilot, and then it's basically game over. If I can run it on your laptop, there's no subscription, there's no data leaving. It's a no-brainer at that stage. What are we doing with the CPU cycles and the GPU cycles on the MacBook when we're developing?
Anyway,
It's
yeah,
just there
yeah.
to.
And it makes sense, like, from a corporate decision making. You could host it, not necessarily centralized host, training off your own data. Like, that's really game over.
Yeah.
Although,
Well, just the beginning of the game, though.
yeah.
Another alternative way of seeing that. It's just the beginning of the fun.
Yeah, beginning of the
Nathan,
arms race. Yeah.
what's the next thing here? What do you expect to come in the coming months and years? Obviously, wild predictions, all the usual disclaimers, but what's your take? What's next in coding? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna give a boring answer, and I think it's just gonna be incremental improvement. AGI, if it's possible, is along no, what are they calling it? But what are they
Artificial
calling it
General
these
Intelligence, yeah,
yeah,
AGI.
AGI. I think that's a ways off, if at all, if it's even feasible. We'll see incremental improvements where the models, I don't want to say hallucinate less because that's a feature, not a bug, but
Yeah.
where they get more and more refined, the output becomes more timely. We're starting to see where it can actually connect live to the internet. So I just think there's going to be incremental advances like that until there's a real breakthrough and that will change the game, like in the same way that the transformer changed the way that we did the natural language processing and text generation. And till there's something like that, it's just going to be just incremental improvement.
So life goes on. NVIDIA makes more chips. They make faster
Mhm.
chips. They become even bigger and they leave the gamers behind even further. And we make bigger models, we train them better, and we get a little bit closer to a superstar junior developer. Is that roughly what we're talking about here?
That's what I would predict. I'm happy to be wrong, unless it's completely detrimental to all of our fine men and women out there giving their blood, sweat, and tears every day in developing software.
Not investment advice, by the way.
Yes, exactly.
Just another disclaimer for our US-based clientele. And what's next for you, Nathan? Do you have an eye for the next book?
I have a couple of ideas brewing. I really am going to avoid doing just a second edition of this, even though I've alluded to it several times. But I have a couple of ideas that are really brewing, and in terms of, okay, so now we know how to use them. We've had some practice. Like, now let's apply it to very specific, very niche problems. And are there ways that we can extend it? Are there ways that we can train it on our own data, things like that? That's where I would see the next logical area for me to move into. But I would still want something very practical. So yeah, I'll probably just wind up doing a second edition.
The book, once again, is called AI Powered Developer. It's published by Manning, which means that it has been available in the early access for a while now. So if you go to manning.com, you can get immediate access and start reading that. It's currently in production, which means that it's going to take a little bit of time before it actually hits places like Amazon in a physical copy, and before Nathan can have a party to celebrate that. My guest was Nathan Crocker, the co-founder and CTO at Checkr. Thank you very much, Nathan. I'll see you next time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Be well.